Hey everybody, we are gonna start today talking about the effects of the Spanish-American War, what the U.S. gained from it, but then some issues that came up as well. If you'll remember from last class, the Spanish-American War officially ended in August of 1898. Not very many Americans died in the fighting, but about 5,000 were killed by disease. Let's talk about the spoils of war, so things that the Americans got because we won. So we gained several territories around the world. In the Caribbean, we gained Puerto Rico. Um, and then in the Pacific, we gained several islands, which you can see if you look to the west of this map. Namely, the most important for us at this point are Guam and the Philippines. Now, we no longer own the Philippines. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but we still do control Guam. The Philippines comes to be a problem for us, mainly because President McKinley, who's president at the end of the war, before he's assassinated, he doesn't want the Philippines necessarily, but obviously we aren't thrilled about giving them back to Spain. And we also don't want to leave them and just let another European country take them over. So that is one issue that we have. We can't just abandon the Philippines, at least in our imperialistic mind. We don't want to give up that control. Other issues, missionaries are eager to get into the Philippines. We talked about this with Hawaii. There's a whole bunch of islands there with new souls that they want to convert to Christianity. Another issue is that um, there's industrialists who want to be able to go to the Philippines. It's new markets for them. It's a place where potentially they can build factories, and so they want to be there as well. And then the other issue that we have is that we actually captured Manila, the capital of the Philippines, after the armistice was signed. So it's not technically ours because it's not part of that peace treaty that we signed with Spain. So what we agree to do instead is, I went forward too soon, but what we agree to do instead is pay Spain for the Philippines. So we end up paying the Spanish $20 million to get the Philippines. There are protests, however, in Congress. Many anti-imperialists, people who don't agree with these ideas of expanding our reach around the world, are not happy. They say that imperialism violates the ideals of our democracy, that it is not who we are as Americans. One person this guy is an anti-imperialist. His name is Thomas Reed. He's called Czar Reed. He was the Speaker of the House in Congress at the time, and he actually resigns in protest because he does not agree with um, the idea of taking over all these new territories. Another group forms called the Anti-Imperialist League. It fights McKinley's moves, especially with the Philippines. It's not excited about it, doesn't agree with what's happening. However, in the end, that is not who wins. The expansionists are the winner, the imperialists. The arguments that they use are that the U.S. must help uplift the underprivileged, the underfed, and the underclad, the people without enough clothing in the world. So clearly we're putting our Western values on these groups of people, especially the Filipinos. And that is who wins. The Senate reluctantly votes on the treaty with Spain to get the Philippines. And okay, so we talked about the end of the Spanish-American War. We talked about what the U.S. has gotten. We've got the Philippines, we have Puerto Rico, we have Guam, we have some other islands like American Samoa in the Pacific as well. Let's turn to what's going on in the Caribbean after the war. Let's start with Puerto Rico. In 1900, the Foraker Act of 1900 gave Puerto Rico some degree of popular government. They have a limited amount of ability to make their own choices for their island. It's true even today. They're still an American territory, although they're not a state. and we can see problems with that even today. If you look at what has happened after Hurricane Maria, um, the Puerto Ricans are having trouble even getting enough power, food, clean water to their island, which is very different if they were considered a state. It's different than what would have most likely have happened if they were a state. Anyway, back to this period of time. By 1917, Puerto Ricans are given American citizenship. So everybody who is in Puerto Rico or who is born in Puerto Rico is an American citizen. But they don't get full self-rule. Even today they don't have full self-rule. Uh, they do have to follow the laws that the United States passes, even though they don't get a say in those laws. They don't have any members of Congress. Many reforms and improvements are made in Puerto Rico after the Foraker Act or under the Foraker Act, but they still want self-rule. And that's true even today in Puerto Rico. There are many people there who would like independence. The big question that the United States has to answer at this time is the U.S. has set down its flag and claimed these territories. Do all the rights and privileges that come to Americans under the Constitution follow? And so the Supreme Court is going to have to decide this. So the Foraker Act is in 1900. In 1901, Supreme Court decides in what are called the insular cases that the flag does not outrun the Constitution. So, in other words, newly colonized people are subject to American rule, but they don't enjoy all American rights. Unless they're made citizens, which the Puerto Ricans are by 1917, but between 1900 and 1917, they're not treated as citizens. And so that's an issue as well. In Cuba, the American military government sets up in Cuba after we win the Spanish-American War. They start passing much needed reforms, civic improvement. They're able to wipe out yellow fever in Cuba, which was huge. We're going to see something similar in Panama in a couple of slides. Not today, not in this lecture, but next class. The U.S. honors the Teller Amendment, does withdraw from Cuba in 1902. However, they're forced to write their own constitution in 1901, and they have to include the Platt Amendment in that constitution. So there are 4 things that you need to know that are included in the Platt Amendment. The first is that the Cubans could not conclude treaties that might compromise their independence. So they can't sign any treaty that might then make them a territory of another country. The U.S. does not want Spain coming back in or other European countries coming back in. They could not take any debt on. So they can't, if they can't pay for it outright, then they can't go into debt. Like the U.S. borrows money all the time, especially now. The Platt Amendment said that Cuba could not do that. The U.S., the third thing, the U.S. had the right to intervene with troops when we saw fit. We felt the need to go into Cuba with our troops. We could do it. And the last thing is that the Cubans had to sell or lease land for naval stations to the U.S. So all of those things are abolished in 1934, except that last point. We are given or sold the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. And that is the 28,000 acre beachhead at Guantanamo Bay. You read about it in the history of that last class as well. Okay, so that's what's happening in the Caribbean. Let's talk about what's happening in the Philippines. Filipinos are not happy at all that the U.S. is there. So when the Spanish-American War started, most Americans were not in the war because of imperialistic motives. They didn't support it because of that. Remember, they are convinced that the Spanish have won up the Maine, and that's why they're in the war. It has nothing to do with imperialism. However, as the war goes on and as all these territories are added, they see the fruits of imperialism benefiting the U.S. And so Americans start saying, this is great. We have all these new territories. We can make some money from this. The other thing that the war did was help reunite the North and the South after the Civil War. Remember, Reconstruction has left the U.S. very divided. So that that is a benefit of the Spanish-American War, this imperialistic motivation and the idea that we're trying to take over all these groups. Not so great. So, in the Philippines, we have what we consider our Eastern Empire. And if you look at that globe, you can see the different places where the U.S. is now, the different islands the U.S. is now having, exerting some control after the Spanish-American War. It is good because it's new markets, it's kind of helping us economically. However, it's burdensome. We have huge naval commitments, huge commitments from our military that have to be in those places. And so we're kind of spread thin militarily. The Filipinos revolt because Spanish-American War is over. They assumed that they would be given freedom, just like we gave freedom to the Cubans. We promised the Cubans we wouldn't take over their country, that they could be free, and they were. Filipinos thought, well, they kicked the Spanish out, they'll give us freedom too. Oops, not what happened. So they started an insurrection on February 4th, 1899, under Emilio Aguinaldo. And he is a Filipino. He is an insurgent. He wants the U.S. out. They're not very well equipped. They fight in the jungles to wage guerrilla warfare, thinking, well, we know the jungle is better than the Americans. We can win this way. Not so much. The Americans build concentration camps to torture captured Filipinos. So it's not like we're very nice to them. Concentration camps. Think about that term and what it means. We capture Filipinos, we treat them very badly. Aguinaldo was captured in 1901. This is a picture of him surrendering aboard the USS Vicksburg in 1901. So he's captured, but the fighting is going to continue for many more months sporadically. And things sustained, but it's going to continue. 4,234 Americans die in this Filipino revolt, compared to, so 4,200 Americans compared to 600,000 Filipinos. So think about that disparity. And as we said before, the prisoners are tortured in these concentration camps. So it's not a great situation, a great humanitarian situation for the Filipinos. Certainly doesn't make the U.S. look very good either. Future President William Howard Taft is installed as the civil governor of the Philippines in 1901, and there's a picture of him on, I guess that's a ram. You can see what he looked like sitting on top of that animal. It's quite a funny picture, actually. But he becomes the civil governor of the Philippines in 1901. The U.S. is going to start trying to assimilate the Filipinos into Western culture. Should make you think of what happened with the Native Americans as we started taking over their land as well. We do start reforming the Philippines, pouring millions of dollars into rebuilding their roads, their sanitation system, their public health system. So that's good. The idea of us colonizing through force that leaves a bad taste in your mouth. We do set up American schools. The idea, again, of assimilating, forcing our culture on other people. If we think about how we felt about that when it was happening to the Native Americans, it's not great. The Philippines are granted their independence on July 4th, 1946. So they celebrate the same Independence Day that we do, although theirs came almost 200 years later. So July 4th, 1946, they are granted their independence. So for almost 50 years, just short of 50 years, the U.S. controls the Philippines. So that ends this part of the lecture. In the next part, you're going to learn about what's happening in China. You're going to learn about Panama, how we get the Panama Canal, and then you're going to learn about Teddy Roosevelt's influence over all of this, because for a lot of this, he is the president, okay, especially after the Spanish-American War. So that will be next class. Hope you've enjoyed this less than 15-minute lecture. I'll see you soon. Bye.